So,
Can you see the presentation mode now?
yes, and we can see you as well. And welcome you to your talk on partitive articles versus bare nouns in Northern Italy, a morphological parameter. The talk is given by Francesco Pinzin from Goethe Universität Frankfurt am Main and Cecilia Poletto, Goethe Universität Frankfurt am Main and Università di Padua. The floor is yours and the screen.
Thank you. Well, I don't know whether I need to tell you this, but since the audience, we are in common setting, but the point is that Romance indefinites have various ways to be realized, and the encoding of indefinite arguments varies according to the Romance language. If you look at Spanish, what you see is that indefinites can be just bare nouns, while in French you need to have this special article, which is called a partitive, although it's not a real partitive, it's just an indefinite. And the form is the one of a preposition corresponding to of plus conflated form of the definite article. So you see here the distinction between Spanish for uncountable singulars in the first example, and plurals, and they are plurals in the second, while in French what you see is just that you have this preposition with a conflated article. So Italian is in between. A language like Italian has both bare nouns and so-called partitive articles. So you can say something like mangio del pane or mangio delle ciliegie or mangio pane, mangio ciliegie. So the point is that we want to concentrate now is whether this sort of oscillation you see here is optionality or whether it's a division of labor. So in particular, the research question we want to answer today is whether Italian partitive articles and bare nouns completely or partially overlap in their distribution or not. Okay, so and the aim is precisely to show you that the distribution is not random, and it's not even social linguistic, it's just a distinction in the system, within the system. If you look at the first type of linguistic atlas, which was made on Italian dialects, the very famous AIS, Atlas Italiens of the Südschweiz, what you see is that there are 4 possible forms attested in Northern Italy. The first one is similar to the one we have seen up to now for French and Italian, with the preposition followed by an article. The second is the one similar to Spanish, so with bare nouns. The third one is a form of the simple definite article. And the last one is a form of a simple preposition. So apparently, 4 forms from 0 article to definite preposition or a conflation of the two. Okay, so this is what you see across Northern Italy in the eyes. So given this distribution, our research question is, what the distribution of those elements are in the Northern Italian dialects. Do they compete for the same semantic field of indefiniteness? And, even more strangely, what is a definite article doing in an indefinite environment? So, definite articles should just be the opposite of this. So how can we model the variation we are going to see? And what is the grammatical source of this variation? So our hypothesis is the following. We don't think there is any optionality between bare nouns and partitive articles in the languages we are going to investigate. And also in standard Italian, we think that partitive articles implicitly include a quantity, while bare nouns don't. Since specificity depends on quantity, hence bare nouns are never specific. However, partitive articles can be specific, but need not be. They're just a quantity, okay? So specificity is implied by quantity. And then in the second part of the talk, we will address another problem, namely what triggers the source of variation. And we will say, in partial accordance with the literature that has already been presented, that the presence of bare noun correlates with the presence of number morphology, not generally, but on regular masculine nouns. So the feminine in our data does not count at all. The methodology we are going to use is that, first of all, we assess data from our data bank, namely the ASIT, Atlante Sintattico Dialetti d'Italia. And in that atlas, we have extracted all the sentences that either have bare nouns or partitive articles or definite articles in those environments. And actually, there are 13 possible sentences, and the output you see is over 2,130 sentences because they have been translated in all the dialects. The problems with this data is that there is an unbalanced stimuli, so they were not thought for a specific investigation on partitive articles and indefinites in general. So what you get is that we have in the stimuli we have 6 bare nouns, 6 definites, and only 1 instance of partitive article. And we know that the input sentences count because people, as we are going to see, our test subjects react differently when in the input sentence you get a bare noun or a definite or partitive article, even if they possess all the 3 forms. Okay, so the unbalanced stimuli are also a problem with respect to the polarity of the sentence because we have 5 negative sentences, just 1 positive sentence for bare nouns, just 1 negative and no positive for partitive articles, and only 2 negatives and 4 positives for definite. So the stimuli are not balanced, okay? Therefore, we thought of going onto the field, and in order to avoid the problems, we have had 3 new fieldwork sessions, and we have investigated 3 types of dialects: Ligurian, Mantuan-Emilian, and Central Eastern Friulian, because as it will become clear, these 3 dialects are representative of the 3 possible patterns that we have already seen for French, Spanish, and Italian. So one type of dialect, just to give you a spoiler, just have bare nouns. That's a Friulian case. Another type of dialects, these are the Mantuan-Emilian, just has partitive articles. And the last one, Ligurian, is similar to Italian in switching between the 2. Okay. So the questionnaire consists of 70 sentences, then as for polarity, gender, number, and adding left and right dislocation, and also for each of the 3 conditions, so partitives, bare nouns, and definites. Plus, we have added some fillers as it is usually the case. So if we first of all look at the data that we can gather from the ASIT, we see that actually definite articles don't really count because in all dialects, the distribution of definite articles is the same. So if you look at, if you have in the input, so if you have in the input a bare noun, you see, a distribution where you have essentially no definites in here in the main areas, okay? And you just have some definites. These are the blue dots, and there are very few old definites. Okay, so these are the lilac points. If you look at the input sentences with definite articles, what you see is that essentially all translations in all the dialects are with definite articles. Okay, so apparently all the dialects have definite articles. And so we think that since there is no variation, definite articles must be something else. And we will see in a minute what this something else is. If you look at definites, once again, you see that also in our balanced fieldwork, the same type of thing occurs. So when you get a definite article in the input, in Emilian, Friulian, and Ligurian, you get almost 100%, so almost at ceiling, definite articles. If in the input you get a partitive, there is a small line of partitives, but the majority of the cases are anyway different. So the definite article does not occur. And the same is true for bare nouns. So essentially, definite articles are always there when the input is the definite article, and are very rarely there when the input is something else. So, this tells also something about the methodology, that input sentences count, for the realization. So essentially, there is no variation. And since there is no variation across the dialects, we don't think that definite articles are actually part of, the variation we see, But in general, definite articles, this type of definite articles are so-called weak definites or generics. And you know, when the input is an indefinite, you can also translate it as a weak definite, you know, but generally when the input is a weak definite, that all varieties that have this type of source will also use it as the answer. By the way, this is also the case for all Romance languages. So essentially there is no variation here, okay? So essentially what we say is that the presence of definite articles is to be read semantically as cases, not as cases of real indefinites, but as cases of weak definites or generic, depending on, you know, the type of terminology you want to use. And therefore, they have to be sorted out from the whole general picture, okay? So from now on, what we are going to do is we are going to investigate just bare nouns and partitives, leaving the definite articles aside. So the first answer to one of the questions we had is, do all these forms compete for the same semantic field of indefiniteness and even definite articles? And the question is no, because definite articles are generally weak definites, and they are something else that does not vary, that is possible in all the Romance languages, okay? So the lack of interdependence between the possible realization of indefinites and the availability of weak definites gives us two different fields, so they have to be kept apart. So if we now concentrate on the distribution of bare nouns and look at the as-it maps, since we just have 3 points in our fieldwork, what you see is that it's quite clearly the case that in the northeast, so in the area of Friuli and Veneto, you see the main concentration of bare nouns. And this is actually true if the input, as in one, is the bare noun. So the input bare noun provides you with an output bare noun. If the input is a partitive article, so the output is a bare noun, it's still concentrated in the same northeastern area. And if the input is a definite, as we have already seen, generally, you know, also the output is a definite, but in the cases in which the speakers decided not to use a definite article, but to use something else, they use a bare noun just in this area. So the northeastern part has many more bare nouns than the western part, okay? If you look at the distribution of partitive articles, what you see is that there is another area that where the most partitive articles are concentrated, and that's the area, you know, that includes part of Liguria, the lower part of Piedmont, and then the all Emilian and Romagnol side. So you see, you know, this area here. And once again, if you have here bare nouns, then generally the input is again a partitive. So these are the dialects that don't use bare nouns so much. Then if you see in map 2, if the input is a partitive, the output is a partitive. And when you have a definite in the input, generally you also have a definite in the output. So essentially, you know, this is the area, if you look at the first two maps, where the most partitive articles are concentrated. There is also, I mentioned also the fact that in some Northern Italian dialects, what you find is just the preposition corresponding to of, so de. And you see here what the areas are for this bare de. As you see, you know, it's the Western Ligurian and part of Piedmont here, so also the Provençal part, and something high in Northern Lombardy, okay? So here high in the Alps, okay? And once again, the first map illustrates when the input has a bare noun, and you see that there is a de in the output. And when the second one, when the input is a partitive and the output is again de. And the third one, as usual now, we know that, you know, if the definite article is in the input, it's also in the output. So, you know, the third map is not really important. So here we have the area where just the bare preposition is used, okay?
Okay, I can share the screen now. Yes. Can you all see?
Yes.
Yes.
Good. Okay, now that Cecilia drove you through our data that, well, our data, the ASID data that we collected and analyzed, I will try to drive you through the data that we collected from the questionnaire that we adopted in order to collect data from Emilia, Friuli, and Liguria. I will go language by language because the overall data are not so telling, because we are interested in the cross-linguistic variation. And so I'm going to explain you what we found in Emilia, what we found then in Friuli, and then in Liguria. Starting with Emilia, we have this graph here. This graph here is separated by input types. Here you have what you have in the input, nominal, partitive, or definite article in the Italian input, and the different colored bars are the output types: nominals, partitives, definites, BRD, and also quantity markers. For Emilia, we see a very clear picture. First of all, as Cecilia already told you, when you give them a definite, basically all the speakers go with a definite. There is no problem for them in translating a definite in Italian with a definite in the local variety. For partitives, we see that Emilian speakers, just like with definites, have no problem. When you give them a partitive in Italian, they just go with the partitive. There is a slight presence of definite determiners, but this is basically always the same in the three different varieties. We also have some statistics at the end if you're interested, but there is no statistically relevant variation in the distribution of the definite articles between Emilia, Liguria, and Friuli. What is interesting is what they do when there is a nominal in the input. When there is a nominal in the input, they usually go for a partitive in the output. They usually translate the nominal with the partitive. Sometimes they translate it with a definite determiner. Again, this happens basically everywhere in the three different varieties. And in some cases, they translate it with a nominal. These few cases are all concentrated, sorry, it is very, very small here, in young and interfered speakers. And again, we have a graph at the end that can show that nominal translations of nominals in Emilia are only concentrated in the young and interfered speakers. With interfered, we mean that these speakers are the only ones working outside the community. So they at work do not speak the local variety. For Friulian, we have a very different picture. First of all, it's basically the same for definites, but we have the opposite for nominals. When we give them a nominals, Friulian speakers just go with the nominal. They perform basically at ceiling, they translate everything with a nominal, with a slight presence of definites, but this again is the background noise of the possibility of translating an indefinite with a definite determiner as generic with definite. For partitive inputs, instead, we see a lot of variation. The first thing we notice is that the output type nominal is present. So Friulian speakers tend to translate partitives with nominals. They also add another option to the picture. So they translate partitives in Italian with quantity markers like un poc, un alc, a bit, or qualche, some. They also translate them with definites, again, as a background noise, and translate them with partitive articles. Again, we find exactly the same pattern that we found for nominals in Emilia. Only the young and interfered speakers basically copy the Italian input. For Ligurian, well, this is going to take a little while more because the data are a bit complex. First of all, we see a new entry, the Verde. Verde appears as a possible translation of nominals and partitives. The second thing to notice is that basically there is a high presence both of nominals and partitives. And there are also a lot of partitives which are the output of a nominal input. This looks like very messy, a messy situation, but it's actually very less messy when we took a deeper look at the data. First of all, looking at the Verde, as we kind of expected, looking at the literature and knowing something about Ligurian, Verde is only concentrated in negative sentences. Only after negation, there is the possibility of producing a bare preposition in a similar way as French speakers do. We also want to underline that the fact that there is Verde under negation is not really correlated with the possibility or probability of producing a bare nominal or a partitive in the positive. There are both varieties in which you have bare de in under negation and partitives under positive polarity, and varieties in which we have bare de under negation and bare nominals under positive polarity. So we think this is an orthogonal feature with respect to the one we are investigating. So for now, we are leaving it out. The second thing to notice is that actually Ligurian becomes a lot less messy if we split the speakers in two. We can see that there is one kind of speaker, which we labeled Ligurian 1, for which bare nominals inputs always translate or almost always translate with partitives. There is another kind of speakers, which we call the Ligurian 2, for which bare nominals in the input always translate with bare nominals. So basically, Ligurian 2 speakers perform following, let's say, the Italian input: definite, definite, partitive, partitive, bare nominal, bare nominal. There doesn't seem to be much of friction between the Italian input and the local variety. While Ligurian 1 is more like Emilia in the data that we have shown, that I have shown you before. So they produce a lot of partitives when bare nominals are there. Summarizing these main findings and trying to answer the first research question: what is the distribution of bare nominals, partitives, bare de in Northern Italian dialects? First of all, in Emilian, we see a very French-like, let's say, distribution in which bare nominals lead to partitives, bare nominals in the input lead to partitives in the output, partitives in the input lead to partitives in the output. The difference between French and Emilian that we have been able to collect is the fact that Emilian speakers do not produce bare de under negation. Ligurian 1 instead is even more similar to French. Bare nominal inputs go to partitives in the local variety, partitives input go to partitives, and they also have bare de under negation. The distribution of bare de under negation is much more complex than just that you have negation and then you have bare de. There are many other parameters we are not talking about here, but you can take a look at Garzoni and Poletto 2020 for all the specifics regarding these parameters. Then we have other languages, the Friulian type of languages, which are very similar to, which is very similar to Spanish. So in this language, bare nominals basically translate with bare nominals, and partitives translate into bare nominals or quantity markers. With quantity markers, I remember you that we talk about things like un poc, un alc, a bit, or qualche, some. Finally, Ligurian 2 basically behaves like Italian. It is the case that bare nominals in the input lead to bare nominals, partitives in the input lead to partitives. The big difference with Italian is the presence of bare de under negation, which for me as an Italian speaker, it's not really the standard way of presenting definites under negation, even if there is people who say that it's marginally possible in Italian. For me, it's not. But the first thing we want, to address with respect to these varieties regards the varieties in which we have both bare nominals and partitives, like Italian and Ligurian 2. As Cecilia already told you before, our big question is this optionality or is this division of labor? In other words, do Italian and Ligurian 2 partitives and bare nominals overlap in their interpretation or not? Our answer is that they do not really overlap. We don't have a final answer on that, let's be clear. Our answers are pretty tentative for the moment. But what we have here points against the fact that it is a case of optionality. Why I'm saying that? Because actually you find both contexts in which you can only use bare nominals and contexts in which you can only use partitives. For example, with long-term habitual activities, like I've been building houses since I was born, it's basically impossible for me in Italian to put a partitive article there. Costruisco delle case da quando sono nato, it has a completely different meaning that I've been building houses since I was born. Instead, but this is well known from the literature, bare nominals cannot be used in specific contexts. You cannot say vino non l'ha sprecato, altro sì, wine, well, It's impossible basically to translate literally in English, but he did not waste some of the wine, but some other he did somehow. The same pattern is found in Ligurian too, so that we see that there are both contexts in which we have only the possibility of using vernominals and contexts in which we have only the possibility of using partitives. How can we try to provide some semantics to this differentiation that we find in Italian and Ligurian too between vernominals and partitives? We tried to formalize this distinction as a privative syntactic semantic feature, meaning that one of the two has something more feature, an additional feature with respect to the other. We characterized this feature as belonging to the partitives and as being some kind of a quantity, meaning that when you add this feature, the denotation of the nominal, which basically before adding this feature is just the property, so it denotes anything that can be labeled that way. If you are talking about houses, everything that can be labeled as a house, then the denotation of the nominal, if you add the quantity, is restricted with respect to the OS1 to an undefined quantity with its extension, meaning that the nominal may not range, in this case, over any possible part of its extension. Specificity, which is something that only partitives have in Italian, requires this Q feature to be present. This means that only partitives can be specific because this specificity, we claim, actually builds on this part of the functional sequence. What happens when varieties like French, Ligurian 1, and Emilian show only partitives? Well, in this case, our understanding is that we have a kind of a syncretism, meaning that one form extends to cover also that other part of the spectrum of the functional sequence, so covering also that part of the sequence, so that we have only one realization, but actually underlyingly, we have two different semantics also in this case. Then what happens with varieties with vernominals plus quantity, like Spanish and Friulian? Well, the answer that we provide is basically the same. This is again very tentative and very rough, but the idea is that in this case, vernominals split the field of indefiniteness with quantities and partitives are simply absent from the picture here. Modeling the variation now. How can we model this kind of variation? Well, we can encode it as a kind of a lexical parameter, meaning that we have either available vernominals or available partitives for these different kinds of languages. This gives us this picture, but actually the fact that we say that we have available vernominals or available partitives doesn't say much about the source of the variation, because we all know that vernominals are not lexical items which we can call out in the lexicon of a language and say, okay, you're present or okay, you're absent. That doesn't mean anything. It's not that you have a vernominal lexical item in the lexicon. Neither you have basically a partitive lexical item, because partitives are built by at least two elements. One is the so-called, let's call it for now, preposition, which is not really a preposition, but the of part, and the other is the definite article. So it's not a single lexical item which we can say is present or not. We know that in all these languages, both the preposition the or the or whatever is present and the definite article is present. So we cannot just say these lexical items are absent. We have to try to at least find some correlations with the presence of real lexical items morph, which can correlate with the distribution that we are seeing here. Luckily for us, there are already hypotheses in the literature. And one of the many hypotheses which have been presented by Delfito Schroeter 91 and differently by Stark 2016 and also by other scholars is that the actual distribution of vernominals and partitives is related to the morphology of gender and number on the noun in the language. Actually, this general idea has been declined in different ways, obviously, in the literature, and we are not really going into the details of the different analyses. What we care is what we do with what we did, at least with this hypothesis. We tried to test it. We tested it with the acid. Clearly, we could not test it with our 3 languages, because in order to test a typological claim like this one, you cannot just take Emilian, Friulian, and Ligurian and go on with the typological claim. You need much more. You need many more languages. These many more languages are only found for us for this area in the ASIT. We checked in the ASIT for the realization of the singular plural couples that we could find. For masculine, we found ragazzo, ragazzi, boy, boys, libro, libri, book, books, and amico, amici, friend, friends, bambino, bambini, kid, kids. For feminine, ragazza, ragazze, donna, donne, sorella, sorelle, it's not really relevant, the translation of these items, stasera and sera. We looked only at regular marking, no lexical specific classes, like, for example, palatal plurals in Friulian, which we know are related to an underlying phonological property of the ending consonant, but there is also an additional lexical specification that is needed, but for details, see Vanelli 2010 and other publications on that. So we only looked at regular marking, not lexically specific classes. What we found is summarized in this picture. First of all, the description. The map shows you with the green dots the areas or the varieties better in which the singular and the plural nouns, versions of the noun, are realized by exactly the same surface form. So, for example, in Forlì, we have i ragazzi, the boy, versus i ragazzi, the boys. This is very similar to what happens in French. With the yellow dots, we have singular, which is not marked or marked by 0, let's say, and plural, which is marked by an additional morph. And the further condition in order to be yellow is that this additional morph has to be the same both for feminine and for masculine. Like in Remanzacco, this Friulian variety, el frut, the boy, versus i fruts, the boys. The brown varieties are the ones in which there is a vocalic alternation at the end, marking singular versus plural, just like in Italian, el toso, i tosi, in Padua 3, the boy, the boys. Then there is this further category, which is not relevant to us because there are really not so many varieties belonging to this one. What we can see is that actually absence of number marking is on the masculine nouns is present in Emilia, is present in Piedmont, and also in this central part of the Lombardy. The other zones, especially Liguria, Veneto, and Friuli, present marking of number on the nominal itself. We draw a correlation with respect to this kind of analysis, meaning that we think that this correlation holds, meaning presence of number marking on n at the masculine, on the noun at the masculine, means that we will have or we will find the pernominals in the language. The interesting fact that we want to underline is that feminines do not count, at least they do not seem to count, because in all the varieties we looked at, we have also a map in the appendix if you want to take a look at that. In all the varieties we looked at which do not have pernominals, actually feminine nouns are marked for singular versus plural, also in the Emilian varieties, which show only partitive articles. So feminines do not seem to be relevant for this kind of correlations. To conclude, we have shown that the distribution of definite articles in these varieties that we are looking at is tangential to the competition between pernominals and particles. We can characterize them as generic with definites, but they are something different, at least in these varieties. It is entirely possible that in other varieties we didn't look at, they enter in the field of indefiniteness, substituting for pernominals and partitives. We actually don't know because we didn't look at those varieties. But for these varieties we looked at, we see that the distribution of definites is tangential to this competition. We have also shown that the distribution of pernominals and partitives in the languages that have both is not actually randomic, that partitives display a quantity reading, or what we try to characterize as a quantity reading, which in turn is implied in context where the indefinite is specific. Binomials cannot be specific because they do not have this quantity reading on which specificity is built. We've also shown that there is a link between the noun morphology and the absence of binomials, which is related to the absence of number morphology, but only in the masculine. Then some concluding methodological generalization, we want to draw your attention to the fact that it is possible to take evidence for the presence or absence of syntactic structure from the way test subjects actually react to stimuli in the standard language. It is always, and in many cases, said that questionnaires have a problem with respect to the input. You clearly provide an input to the speakers, and this fact influences the reaction of the speaker. Well, a way out of this problem is simply measuring this impact that you have. So you try to balance for your input the different, the questionnaire, and then you measure what happens in the different populations. If you do that, then you can get away with a questionnaire and measuring also something in addition. We also want to underline that if a given structure is just not present in the dialect, test subjects will avoid it in the dialect and try to use an alternative strategy. This alternative strategy might be also helpful in understanding the semantic value of the original structure in the input. We all know that the speakers we interviewed are perfectly bilinguals between the roof language Italian and the specific varieties. So the fact that Friulian speakers actually tend to translate Italian particles with some or a little quantity marker tells us something with respect to how the speakers understand the sentences containing a partitive. Then we also notice that some speakers display a stronger interference with the standard, especially the young ones. And this might be due to the fact, obviously, that they are more exposed to the standard roof language, and that phenomenon that we might call, in this case, priming is more probable to occur in these cases. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think the floor is open now to the questions. Do you have a preference for not recording the questions, or?
I have a question and I can be recorded.
Go ahead, please.
Okay, so I have two questions actually. One is a general question about the informants. You mentioned some younger informants that had interference or so. So I was wondering, what is the age of your informants? Because especially in Liguria, I'm not sure that there are many young people who speak the vernacular variety with real competence and without a lot of interference. Yeah. And the second question was, if we can have a look at slide 22.
Okay, I will share again. Just one moment. Okay. Can you see it?
Yes.
Yes.
Good.
So here in Italian, you have del vino non l'ha sprecato. But if you had vino non ne ha sprecato, that would be possible, perfect for me. But in Ligurian, you have the partitive particle here, not the law. Okay, so I mean, it's not exactly the same as the Italian, because in Italian, I don't know if you agree, but vino non ne ha sprecato is okay.
But not when you add the counteralter of dell'altro sì, of other, yes. That is the point. When you're comparing two quantities, at least in my Italian, I cannot have the pronominal.
I would never say this sentence in any, I mean, I would never say del vino non l'ha sprecato, dell'altro sì. And I would never say vino non ne ha sprecato, altre, I would say something. I mean, this is not something I would ever say, so I cannot give a judgment. That's but the thing I wanted to point out is that in Ligurian you use ne, so it's not the same.
But if I remember well, also in French, when you have specific readings, but obviously Tabe and other can tell us more about this. When you have specific readings of partitives, you still have the un. So this is a matter of what happens with the un. So what the un does in the different varieties, and that is something that yet we obviously have to look at, but it's probably orthogonal to this. And I don't know if someone
there is a lot of variation concerning what the element ne does in the various Italian varieties. For instance, extraction out of a place is not always grammatical, etc. But that's completely independent from our partitive articles, in a sense, right?
I mean, for me, del vino non l'ha sprecato dell'altro sì is really on the verge of non-acceptability, because it's I would never, I couldn't say something like that. I couldn't say something like that.
Yeah, there is a lot of variability between Italian speakers with respect to this. For example, for me, it's perfectly okay, but I also say something like non parlo di dei ragazzi. For me, it's okay. I use the partitive everywhere.
That's okay for me too.
Oh, okay.
But I would say vino ne ha sprecato e altre cose or something like that, but it's del vino non l'ha sprecato that I find. So it's very hard for me to give a judgment on this sentence, but okay, but thank you for the answer.
And with respect to the other one, sorry, just for the first question.
Yes.
Yes. Here we have the graph, which is very, very ugly. And that's why we didn't show it, because simply we don't have enough speakers. So we cannot really find meaningful correlations for now. This is just a tendency. But the fact that 1 million speakers who produced Bernominals are on the lowest part, exactly like Friulian speakers who produced partitives, tell us something. And as you noticed, the Ligurian speakers are all old. And that is something that we cannot do anything about. There are not many young speakers who speak Ligurian.
Yeah, that's what I thought about Ligurian, yeah. Okay, thank you.
I was actually looking at the data on Friulian with a student of mine who also gathered data for us. And it came out that the person who has produced the biggest amount of partitives in Friulian is actually the mother coming from a different place. So that was probably not a good informant. So that's probably much more noisy. It's noisy in the data.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Thank you for the question and the answer. Any other questions?
I wanted to comment on what Silvia Luraghi said.
Okay, go ahead.
On the second slide, there was this, again, about this del vino non l'ha sprecato. Even though I'm not from the north part of Italy, but I feel like that would be acceptable for me if you added something like a full noun, like una parte del vino non l'ha sprecata, un'altra sì, or something like that. If you don't have to use a sort of like this kind of analytical partitive article or this ne particle, I would totally go for like the noun sort of.
Yeah,
just as a comment.
That's sort of expected, because it's, the fact that these elements don't signal any longer a real quantity, a real partitive, is mostly concentrated in the north. So you are just sort of confirming the idea that in the center, in the southern of Italy, these forms of, preposition plus article are real partitives, are still real partitives. And yes. The other thing is that I don't think we should look at standard Italian in these cases. That's why we are looking at dialects, because there is too much variation on those. So
and there's a lot of confusion,
yeah.
As well. True.
Because there is not one single standard Italian. So what can you do? You just look at the dialects. They are smaller languages. They are natural languages. They are not, informed by grammarians, etc. And so there you can see a clear picture of differentiation. Otherwise, for standard Italian, it's too big a mess.
Yeah.
But thank you.
Thank you. It was interesting.
Thank you. And thanks, Basile, for coming. You will be due next time to give your talk. And please send an abstract and a title.
Yes,
Sorry about the confusion.
it's okay.
Any other questions? If not, I actually had a question about the regularities. If you have a language without gender and without articles, have you thought what kinds of regularities there would be? What have
Language without gender and without articles?
Yeah, let's say you have Russian. Russian has gender and plural marking. There is some variation, I guess. You have the Finnic languages where you have no articles at all, but you have case, right? And you have no gender.
I don't know, I would like to think about this comparison between languages, looking at the different contexts in which we elicited in the different dialects. Because it's not always the case that when we say definite articles or articles in general in Russian, or articles that are not there, but articles in Italian or in other languages would mean the same thing. So I actually don't know. And I would have to take a look at the data, what the speakers from these languages do in the different contexts, and then see the regularity, if there is one there, with respect to this differentiation that we highlighted here. But yeah, I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Well, in essence, what we would expect is either that you get a situation like Friulian, since you have no articles, it's all identical,
Mm-hmm.
or that you have a situation that still distinguishes between those languages that have a quantity marker,
Mm-hmm.
those languages that don't. Because I think that, the most important thing that came out from our fieldwork, so our hypothesis is really based on our fieldwork, is that our Friulian speakers, since they are bilingual, when they were trying to translate the partitive, and since they know that there is no partitive in Friulian, they took a quantitative marker. So it's actually them who suggested to us that, there must be something about, quantifier there, because they spontaneously added it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I would say, maybe languages like, the Slavic languages have some similar phenomenon of realization of a quantifier there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I was also thinking a little bit about contact situations. For instance, on the borderline areas of languages which do have articles, such as the Scandinavian languages, in contact with the Samic or Finnic languages. So there is actually some data about some kinds of partitive articles in the Nordic dialects of the article languages, Scandinavian languages. And I was thinking it might be interesting for you to have a look into these Nordic dialects a little bit, to see if some of your because you do have articles, so.
But I think for what I understand and from what I know, that the distribution of the articles in those languages is very different from the distribution that we have in Italian or Italian dialect. It's so they are different beasts somehow. They might overlap for some constructions, for some semantics that you want to express, but they are different beasts. So I would have to get a bit more data and get a bit more knowledge with respect to the distribution of these elements, and then possibly make a prediction. I don't know, like this, but it could be super interesting to look at these kind of languages.
Yeah, I was just thinking what kinds of interesting predictions could come out, what kinds of interesting hypotheses could be made on the basis of you know, a contact situation where you have a case which is partitive, and in combination with a language which has articles, and the articles turn into some kind of partitive articles. So what's the contact effect? What's the semantics of these things then at the end of the day? And
yeah, that's
and what,
yes, that's the basic question. What is the
Yeah.
semantics of these things?
Yeah.
And we can elicit it in the different languages and see what people do. But since for now the semantics is really, really uneducated and not so much educated guess, it's going in dark for now, at least.
Yeah.
Mm.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Can I just add a comment on French?
Right. Yeah, please go ahead.
Since Francesco, you asked about the partitives, it is very common, or like knowledge or admitted in the literature, that there is an undetermined quantity, right, in those elements. So that's quite you know, assumed in the literature since Milner, 1978, for instance, right? So it's a kind of standard assumption. But then for the example in 21 that you mentioned before, I had a really hard time to translate these into French. I think it is maybe a little bit different. So if the first part of the sentence was all right, but then the contrast in the second part, I find it extremely difficult, if not impossible, with the partitive article at the beginning. I don't know if it's related to whether it's singular or plural, but at least I found these examples extremely difficult in French, so it's maybe different.
Yeah, that is interesting. That might also point, well, it depends obviously in the, with respect to the different kinds of Italian, standard Italian, but might point to the fact that partitive articles in French extend to the lowest part, but also are cutted on top somehow and do not extend to some other functions that are covered by partitive articles in Italian, at least for some speakers like me, but maybe for others, those are not covered. So yes, that might point to that fact, but yeah, we have to construct better contexts in order to elicit more concrete and clear data, I think, with respect to this.
Yeah, it's easier with the plural. It's true that it's easier with the plural. We didn't talk about the distinctions between plurals and mass nouns in singulars, but there are, you know, there are a lot of distinctions. Also, you know, you can see that they are not exactly the same thing. And as for the story about quantity, I think that the problem with Italian is to understand what this apparent optionality is doing there. Right, and we think that apparently, if you think about it in nanosyntactic terms, you know, you could have the bare noun that just does not spell out all the, you know, the categories on top, while they are left to the du form, so to speak, right, to the del form. So it also comes out quite neatly, and Francesco is working on this. You know, I would rather go with a null quantity noun, a la Kane, while probably Francesco would go for an nanosyntactic approach, being, I don't know, more modern maybe.
Different, let's say. Let's see, there is a question.
May I?
Yeah.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. It was very interesting to watch and to listen. Do you have any idea? I mean, you showed the correlation with regard to the gender number marking hypothesis at the end. Do you have any guess why it looks so quite neat for the masculine and then it doesn't for the feminine? Is there?
Yes.
Yeah.
Do you, well,
yeah, go ahead, Francesco.
Yes.
Go ahead.
There are two possibilities for which, well, we don't have the data to decide on which one we prefer. The first one is to say that it is relevant, actually, it's the asymmetry which is relevant. So it doesn't matter if it's feminine or masculine, if you have at least one gender in which you don't have marking, then that triggers the absence of binomials. Okay. The other hypothesis is that masculine is really the relevant feature in play here. And that is testable, obviously, if we find languages in which feminine is completely unmarked, but masculine is marked, then we have predictions. But for now, we don't have this kind of languages. We only have a couple of languages in the Alps in which feminine nouns have the same marker for singular and plural. It's not absence of marking, it's one single marker A, but there is an S which goes off and on the noun, so you never know what's happening. And so we need the clear data in order to decide, first of all, which of these two hypotheses is the more likely to be correct. And our guess for now is that the asymmetry one makes more sense. So if you have an asymmetry, so at least one of the genders presents no marking on the N for singular versus plural, plural versus singular, then you will have absence of binomials, and possibly because well, there is a possible story there. I'm not going to bore you with that, but it's about what the root by itself can realize or spell out, and what the other things can realize when you consider the root as something that potentially realizes some part of the functional sequence, but that is something that is not fully worked out for now.
I was going to say, I'm very glad to hear that you're trying to work it out, because that would be really, yeah.
Well, you know, the other possibility would be to say in a bit more old-fashioned style, that all nouns have to raise up to a certain projection in order for, you know, bare nouns to be possible.
Yeah.
And that will be, you know, if all nouns have to do that, then it's clearly the masculine that is generally the unmarked, you know, version of the pair, the masculine singular and the masculine plural that has to raise. If that does, then you get bare nouns, because all nouns do raise to a certain projection to be identified. That,
yeah,
could be the part. And I don't know whether there are any dialects that have no marking on the masculine. No, the other way around. That have no marking. Yeah, no marking on the feminine, but on the masculine. But you know, we will see. It's not really foreseen in terms of, you know, markedness theory, but there are violations. So.
And I mean, the other thing is, I know that wasn't really the main point you wanted to make or to address. I would still really encourage you, if you have energy, to go on and look at the definites which you get from input sentences that do not contain definites. I agree that there is some kind of weak referentiality, weak definiteness at stake. But I'm not sure if I understood you completely correctly, but those things are strange cross-linguistically nevertheless. So, I mean, if you would have a French L1 speaker translate an English input sentence with a bare noun, you wouldn't get, I would guess, you wouldn't get a definite article. So I would be very curious to see why Italian has those weak definites so easily, whereas French, if I'm correct, doesn't. I mean, I know that's not the research question, but that was just...
What we noticed is that with respect to the presence of definites in translations of binomials or partitives, is that in many cases they concentrate on specific sentences, and we realized later that in those sentences we as Italians can use the definite determiner there. So it's a possibility to use for basically covering the same denotation, the definite determiner or the binomial and the partitive, or the binomial or the partitive, depends on the input sentence. So it seems to be that kind of evidence that leads you to say that whatever your explanation for weak definites, generic definites is for Italian, then it can be carried over to these varieties. This is the main point. So there is no real variation for these varieties we looked at with respect to this. Then for French, yes, that might be interesting to look if there is a difference in the distribution of these ones, looking at more questionnaires and more data. That could be super, super interesting. Thank you.
I don't want to take too much of the floor.
Go ahead.
May I?
Yes, go ahead.
Are the input, you just said the input sentences for which you got definites in the answers were always similar input sentences. Did you notice semantic regularities in the input sentences, like sentence genericity,
Yeah. So what we think is that so that, those cases are cases of ambiguous sentences between a generic interpretation and an indefinite interpretation. That would be probably, on the other hand, if French doesn't do the same as Italian, it might have to do with the fact that the definite article is a different animal in French with respect to Italian, which is also, essentially true, because the distribution is different. Also, apart from, from indefinite, in general, the distribution of definite articles is a bit different in French. So it's more widespread in French than it is in Italian.
Thank you. Very, very interesting, really.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you for the question and the answers. Any other people who would like to ask a question still?
I have a question, and Elvira maybe also?
No.
Okay.
So my question would have been what David answered, questioned, asked.
About regional variation within the regions. Do you think that there is also regional variation? So for Ligurian, for instance?
Oh, do you mean now a regional variation concerning the regional Italian or concerning the dialects?
No, concerning the dialects.
Well, there is definitely variation, as you can see, even, from Ligurian 1, Ligurian 2, there is definitely a lot of variation. But, in our project, we had decided to take 3 different points as representatives of 3 different types of varieties, because we could not do that much. Also due to the fact that, after the pandemic, Francesco could not go testing and, part of the fieldwork we originally had planned has not really been performed because of this reason. But we know that there is much more variation. And so I tend to think that Friulian is rather homogeneous from this point of view. So Friulian doesn't have partitive articles in general. All the Friulian varieties are rather similar in this case. In Liguria, you find variation, and I would rather say, well, depending on, probably Emilian is also more stable.
Mm-hmm. Emilian looks like the more stable one in our data for now. It seems that they just have partitives all over the place. It's just like they don't do pernominals at all. Friulian is stable, but there are a bit more partitives than we expected. But again, they're more concentrated in young people, and Ligurian is really a mess. So different varieties. And these people that I interviewed are friends. They're actually friends. They've known each other since they were young, and they produced different outputs. So one coherently produced every time a partitive from a binomial input, the others produced binomials from binomials. And they basically see each other every day. Something that we can say, but it's just a guess for now because we don't have the data, is that Ligurian one is one speaker, unfortunately, because we don't have many, but it was very consistent. Ligurian one told me that he could be influenced by the fact that he reads every day old Ligurian. and I won't tell his name, but he is a professor, linguistic professor. So he reads every day about Old Ligurian and so on. So he might be influenced by the fact that he does linguistic work on Ligurian too. So that might be one of the possible explanations. But again, we need more data for declaring who the culprit is.
Now I have a question. What about your questionnaire? Do you share it somewhere, or I would be interested in knowing exactly what the sentences are and thinking a little bit, because I'm constantly thinking about how to translate the method you used perhaps on our German data, dialectal data. And so it would help to have the concrete input data, the concrete questionnaire questions to think further.
Yes, it's in Italian for now, and I
no
think
problem.
Yes, I know. Yeah, that's true. And it's going to be also in some publication, but we can send it to you. Yeah,
that would be nice. Yeah.
Francesco, try to put it in the chat if you can find it now on the spot.
Yeah, it's that I have many versions and I don't know which one is the one that I actually used and the more complete one with respect to the context and everything. So I have to search for it just a little bit before sending the wrong one. I can send it to the, is there a mailing? Yes, to the mailing
list. Yes, the Corte list.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you. That's a great idea. Are there more questions? Okay. Thank you very much for this inspiring talk and these fantastic questions and answers. I would then stop the recording and maybe we should discuss some organizational issues or something like that. Is that okay for everyone? Okay, thank you very much.